They tossed you aside like it was nothing, and strange, isn't it, how a single careless moment can strike deeper than 1,000 promises. One gesture, one shift, one quiet dismissal, and suddenly you feel the weight of the entire story collapsing in your hands. For a heartbeat it stuns you, for a breath it wounds you in places even your memories cannot reach. And for a moment, brother, you think this is where your story ends, but it isn't. Because sometimes the moment you think you're breaking is the exact moment you're being rebuilt. There is a silence that arrives after someone discards you, not the silence of defeat, not the silence of emptiness, but a different kind of stillness. A stillness that rearranges your inner world without making a sound. At first you feel the void they left behind. But then something unexpected begins to rise inside it. Clarity, strength, self-respect. And the deeper truth finally surfaces. Being tossed aside never defined your worth. It revealed theirs. They didn't let you go because you were insignificant. They let you go because your presence exposed everything they couldn't face. Your depth, your sincerity, your emotional courage, your refusal to play small. Fragile people don't know what to do with someone real. So they push you out, call you too much, pretend you were the problem, when the truth is painfully simple. You were more than their ego could handle. Before we go deeper, take a second, like this video to anchor your strength, and subscribe to Stoic Station so you never walk this path alone. Start this journey now. 1. Silence is not surrender, it's recalibration. There's a moment every man carries like a scar, the moment she tossed you aside as if your presence weighed nothing. That split second when you realized you were no longer needed, no longer considered, no longer held in the place you once occupied. It shakes something inside you because it feels as if her decision carved a definition into your identity, as if her rejection stamped something permanent on your worth. You replay the effort you gave, the loyalty you offered, the patience you held on to, even when it exhausted you. And yet, she walked away without hesitation, as though the connection meant far less to her than it did to you. Your first instinct is always the same. You want to prove your value. You want to show her she was wrong about you. You want to chase clarity, fix the collapse, restore the narrative you thought both of you were building together. But the painful truth is that the more you reach, the farther she drifts. The more you try to hold the pieces in place, the more she pulls away. Because your desperation feeds her ego while silently draining your dignity. You begin to feel like you're fighting a war whose battlefield is shifting beneath your feet, and every move you make pushes you deeper into the quicksand. This is where the shift begins, the place most men never recognize until they've suffered long enough. Your silence is not defeat. It is not resignation. It is the moment you reclaim the energy you poured into someone who never knew how to protect it. Silence becomes your reset button, the quiet recalibration of a man who has finally realized that chasing validation only chains him to the one who took him for granted. Instead of fighting to be seen, you withdraw into the place where your strength was born, your own stillness. In that stillness, something powerful realigns. The imbalance begins to correct itself. The weight you once carried starts to fall away. You stop explaining yourself to someone who was never listening. You stop performing emotional labor for someone who never reciprocated. And slowly the dignity you thought you lost finds its way back to you. When you stop talking, when you stop rushing toward the person walking away from you, your power, which was leaking through every attempt to fix the unfixable, finally returns home. And this is where the real transformation begins, not in the noise of conflict, but in the silence of a man who chooses himself again. Because the moment you embrace silence is the moment the story shifts in a direction she never saw coming. Your stillness becomes the doorway to the next truth, the one that reveals what happens when the man she expected to collapse stands back up without her. 2. The story flips the moment you stop reacting. She always believed your silence would be the moment you finally broke, the moment you folded, reached out, apologized for things you never did, and tried to stitch together a connection she herself had torn apart. What she never understood is that silence, when chosen by a man who has been pushed to his limit, does not shatter him. It shatters her ego first. She expected the familiar pattern, the tears, the explanations, the emotional collapse she had grown accustomed to. She counted on the panic she once saw in your eyes, the urgency in your voice, the way you tried to make sense of her sudden changes in tone, affection, or attention. It always worked before. You reacted and she felt powerful. You chased and she felt desired. You explained yourself and she felt justified. Your emotional responses were the stage where her ego performed, the mirror where she validated her importance. But this time, when the silence arrived, it arrived clean. No message, no panic, no emotional payment, nothing for her to feed on, nothing for her to decode, nothing for her to measure her significance against. And that nothingness is what begins to disturb her. Because when you stop reacting, her identity, built on the reassurance of your responses, loses fuel. The confidence she projected starts to tremble. The narrative where she held the upper hand suddenly has no audience. Without your reactions, the version of herself she relied on becomes unstable. She begins to wonder why you're quiet, why you're distant, why you're no longer orbiting around her emotional weather. That wondering grows into discomfort, and discomfort grows into doubt. This is the moment the entire story flips. Your silence removes the stage she once used to control the rhythm of the relationship. It takes away the spotlight, the script, the cues she depended on. When the man who once responded to every shift now responds to nothing, the power dynamic collapses. You stop playing the role she cast you in, and her control dies with the plot she created. 3. Silence removes their power, one layer at a time. Silence is the one thing they can't bend, twist, or manipulate. It's the boundary they can't cross and the language they can't rewrite. And that's exactly why it unnerves someone who once measured her worth through how strongly you reacted to her distance. When she pulled away, your heart rushed forward. When she grew cold, you tried harder. When she withdrew, you stepped in to fill the gap. You cared deeply, so every cold moment cut deeper, and your reactions became the proof she used to feel significant. For a long time, she controlled the rhythm. She could push, pull, disappear, reappear, offer half attention, then vanish again. And your emotions filled in every empty space. You explained what hurt. You asked for clarity. You tried to reconnect whenever she drifted. Without realizing it, you became the emotional foundation she stood on. Your responses allowed her to avoid facing her own patterns, her triggers, her fears. As long as you reacted, she never had to look inward. Your emotions were the mirror she used to avoid her own reflection. But when the silence comes, real silence, chosen silence, the emotional mirror disappears. The empty space she created finally shows her the truth, herself. No one to blame, no one to absorb the impact, no one to cushion the weight of her actions. Silence removes her audience. It removes her leverage. It removes her ability to dictate the pace of the connection. The dynamic she once controlled begins to fall apart because she no longer has access to the emotional cues she relied on. And as each layer of silence strips away the illusions she built, the truth becomes harder to avoid. She can no longer test your reactions because there are none. She can no longer seek validation through your pain because you refuse to offer it. She can no longer mask her insecurities with your devotion because your energy is no longer available to hold her together. Without you to bounce her ego off of, the identity she constructed starts to wobble. The entire illusion collapses, not because you fought harder, but because you finally stopped fighting at all. And in that collapse lies the shift she never expected, the moment where your silence becomes the force that reveals everything she tried to hide. And from here, the next layer of truth begins to unfold. The realization that once your energy is no longer hers to control, her entire sense of power has nowhere left to stand. 4. When you become steady, she begins to unravel. A man who stops reacting becomes a mystery she can't decode, and that mystery shakes her far more than any anger or heartbreak ever could. She expected you to shatter under the weight of her distance, to fall apart the moment she pulled away. In her mind, you were supposed to chase, question, beg, and implode the way you always did. That pattern gave her comfort. It assured her she still mattered, still held the emotional upper hand, still had access to your vulnerability whenever she wanted it. But something changed. Instead of spiraling, you grew calm, dangerously calm. Calm in a man terrifies the one who expected chaos, because chaos is predictable. She knew how to navigate your desperation, but she has no idea how to navigate your steadiness. Your silence doesn't signal defeat. It signals a shift in identity. You're no longer the man who needed her clarity to function. You're no longer trying to pull her closer just to feel grounded. You found your footing within yourself. And that steadiness exposes everything she tried to hide, her doubts, her insecurity, her unhealed wounds. When you stop collapsing for her, she can no longer pretend the imbalance was your fault. She can no longer blame your reactions for the instability she carried long before you entered her life. Your calmness becomes a spotlight, illuminating the truths she avoided while your emotional chaos distracted her. That's why she becomes uneasy, not because you changed into someone new, but because you finally stopped being the man who broke himself to keep her comfortable. And this is where the tension begins to shift, because a steady man forces her to confront what she never wanted to see, the version of herself she could only hide when you were too busy falling apart. 5. Ego falls, not when you cry, but when you stop. Her ego survived every tear you shed, every argument you tried to resolve, every attempt you made to fix what was already fractured. None of it shook her because each emotional reaction, from the pain in your voice to the desperation in your explanations, only reaffirmed her importance in your world. Your pain was her validation. Your confusion was her comfort. As long as you were fighting for her, she never had to question herself. She could step back, withdraw, or even break you a little, knowing you would still show up trying to hold everything together. But something shifted the moment you stopped trying. Not slowly, not subtly, sharply, cleanly, quietly. And that quietness cracked something inside her that your tears never could. Because indifference hits harder than heartbreak, and silence cuts deeper than shouting. The absence of your voice, your effort, your explanations becomes the loudest truth she's ever heard. She never feared your pain. She feared a version of you who no longer gave her the power to cause it. When you withdraw, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, the ego she hid behind begins to fracture. She can no longer lean on your reactions to stabilize her identity. She can no longer measure her significance through how quickly you tried to fix the damage she caused. When there's no one left to absorb her emotional chaos, she is forced to face the weight of it alone. And in that loneliness, she realizes something she never expected. Your silence isn't punishment, it's emancipation. Your silence tells her what your words never could. I'm done giving you the power to hurt me. It tells her that the version of you she could manipulate, guilt, or confuse no longer exists. That you've stepped out of the emotional loop that kept both of you trapped. And once she senses that power shift, the ground beneath her begins to tremble. Because a man who cries is still emotionally invested, A man who argues is still emotionally available, but a man who stops is gone. 6. Distance isn't punishment, it's healing. She thinks your silence is retaliation, a calculated move meant to sting her the way she once stung you. But what she never understood is that distance, for a man who has been stretched beyond his emotional limits, is not a weapon. It's the only remaining path to sanity. You no longer crave being understood by someone who never truly listened. For so long you begged for clarity, yet she responded with confusion. You reached for connection, but she hid behind avoidance, always slipping away the moment things became real or required accountability. Little by little, that cycle drained you. The conversations that went nowhere, the explanations that were dismissed, the emotional investment that was met with coldness or inconsistency. Eventually, even your hope felt heavy. What once felt like love began to feel like labor, and what once made you feel alive began to make you feel small. You didn't lose your strength. You exhausted it trying to pull someone toward a future she kept running from. This is why distance becomes medicine. Not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, but because you finally realized you cannot heal in the same space where you were breaking. Silence stops being a reaction to her behavior and becomes a response to your own need for peace. It's the moment you recognize that saving yourself is more important than saving a connection that was never balanced. Through space, you begin reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away, trying to hold the relationship together. Your clarity, your confidence, your emotional grounding. And the deeper truth is this: you are not punishing her. You are choosing yourself. You are healing in ways she cannot follow, not because she lacks the desire, but because she lacks the capacity. She could not walk with you into emotional depth, so she cannot walk with you into emotional restoration. The distance you create becomes the boundary you always needed, the line that protects your peace and prevents you from slipping back into the version of yourself that tolerated what should have never been acceptable. 7. Her fear isn't losing you, it's losing access to you. A fragile ego doesn't fear your absence, it fears your evolution. And the moment you begin to rise into a version of yourself she no longer recognizes, that fear becomes unmistakable. She never worried about losing you, not really. What she feared was losing the access she once had to your time, your attention, your emotional responsiveness. For a long time, she depended on your reactions to feel powerful. Every time she pulled away and you chased, it reassured her that she still mattered, that she still held a place of influence in your life. It wasn't love that comforted her, it was control. But now, something has shifted. You've stopped chasing, stopped explaining, stopped interpreting her mixed signals as depth or affection. And that pause, your silence, tells her a truth she was never prepared to face. You're no longer waiting in the emotional doorway she used to leave open just enough to keep you hopeful. Your stillness becomes the evidence she can't ignore. She senses it in the lack of response, in the absence of urgency, in the way you no longer rush to repair what she consistently broke. This is where the unraveling begins, because your silence doesn't just create distance, it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one thing a weak ego cannot tolerate. She starts questioning herself in ways she never had to before. Why isn't he reacting? Why doesn't he care? Why is he suddenly calm when chaos used to shake him? She's not grieving the loss of you. She's grieving the loss of her influence over you. And nothing scares a person with a fragile ego more than losing influence over someone strong. Your evolution forces her to confront parts of herself she used to hide behind your devotion. She can't use your emotions to stabilize her identity anymore. She can't rely on your chase to validate her worth. She can't depend on your confusion to excuse her inconsistency. When access disappears, her sense of control disappears with it, and the illusion she built around her importance collapses. Your silence marks the boundary she never believed you would draw. It shows her that the man who once revolved around her now stands firmly in his own center. And in that moment, she realizes something she never saw coming. She didn't lose the man, she lost the power she had over him. And that fear becomes the catalyst for what comes next. The moment she realizes the doorway she played with for so long has finally closed. 8. Silence exposes the truth she never wanted to admit. Your silence becomes the mirror she avoided for years. The mirror that finally reflects a truth she never had the courage to face. For so long, she never truly saw you. Not your depth, not your sincerity, not the way you showed up with consistency and presence. She only saw what you offered her: validation, attention, emotional labor. You were the steady heartbeat in a connection she never fully stepped into. You gave presence, and she responded with distance. You reached for closeness, and she hid behind half-efforts and emotional shortcuts. You offered depth, and she answered with ambiguity disguised as independence. But silence. Silence removes the fog she used to hide behind. It strips away the excuses, the distractions, the storytelling she used to justify her lack of effort. For the first time, she doesn't have your warmth to soften her coldness. She doesn't have your reassurance to mask her inconsistency. She doesn't have your explanations to hide her emotional absence. And all she sees in the quiet space you leave behind is her own avoidance staring back at her. Your silence becomes the moment the psychological theater ends. Every pattern she used to rely on, your chase, your comfort, your willingness to fix every fracture, disappears. And without those familiar dynamics, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The relationship was never balanced. It was never two people meeting each other with equal intention. It was one person offering connection and another person taking refuge in distance. Your silence exposes that imbalance with a precision that words never could. And the realization hits her harder than any argument. You weren't too much. You weren't overwhelming. You weren't the cause of chaos. You were simply the only one showing up with emotional courage, and she couldn't meet you where you stood. Not because she didn't want connection, but because connection required a version of herself she never developed. Silence forces her to confront that. It removes the illusion that you were the problem and exposes the truth she buried under excuses. She was incapable of offering what she demanded. And here's where the story shifts in your favor. As she sits with that truth, slowly, uncomfortably, something in her begins to unravel. She starts replaying moments where you were patient, present, giving. She begins to recognize the weight of every time you offered sincerity, and she answered with detachment. She realizes the emotional gap wasn't created by your intensity, but by her inability to step into the depth you provided. And the more she sees it, the heavier it becomes. Your silence doesn't punish her, it reveals her. It reveals the parts of her she worked so hard to hide behind: confidence, chaos, and ambiguity. It reveals that what she called freedom was really fear. What she called independence was emotional avoidance. What she called you being too much was simply her inability to rise to the level of a real connection. 9. When you withdraw, the tests begin. The moment you pull back your energy, something shifts. Almost instantly. She can feel it, not in your words, because you're not giving her any, not in your actions, because you're no longer performing. She feels it in the quiet, in the space where you used to pour yourself out without hesitation. And that silence becomes the alarm bell that tells her the truth she was never prepared to face. She no longer owns your mind. That's when the tests begin. At first she reaches for nostalgia, those soft reminders of better days, the memories she once ignored but now wields like bait. A message that sounds tender, a reference to something only the two of you shared. A subtle attempt to tug on the emotional threads she knows used to pull you back without resistance. When that doesn't work, she shifts tactics, sweetness, unexpected warmth. a tone dipped in familiarity and fondness, designed not to reconnect, but to verify whether the old version of you is still alive. And when sweetness doesn't move you, she tries the quiet disappearances, the sudden silence she once used to trigger panic in you. She hopes the old reflex awakens, the overthinking, the reaching out, the need to fix what was never broken on your side. But the silence that once controlled you now rolls off your shoulders, because you've changed, and she can feel it in the air around your restraint. None of these tactics are signs of care, they're signs of fear. Fear that the emotional leverage she once relied on has slipped from her hands. Fear that the power dynamic she built on your reactions has collapsed. Fear that you're no longer the man who sacrificed himself for clarity she never offered. And fear in people like her never presents itself honestly. It hides inside patterns designed to provoke you. But your lack of reaction dismantles each test one by one. The nostalgia falls flat. The warmth cools instantly when you don't return it. The disappearances lose their sting when you don't chase. Every attempt she makes to pull you into the old cycle collapses because the man she once controlled no longer exists. Your emotional world has shifted. Your boundaries have evolved. Your silence has become something she cannot decode. And with every failed test, she feels the ground beneath her identity shaking. Because these weren't just games, they were her way of confirming that she mattered more than your self-respect. When those strategies stop working, she's forced to face a truth she never wanted to accept. The connection only survived because you kept it alive. The moment you stop feeding it, the illusion starves. Your silence becomes your shield, protecting your peace, your clarity, your growth. It becomes your standard, refusing to participate in dynamics that drain you. It becomes your line in the sand, the boundary that says, I don't return to what breaks me. 10. Silence rebuilds you and exposes them. A man reborn in silence carries a power no one can imitate, because it's a power forged in the places where everything once hurt. There's a moment every man reaches after being tossed aside, a moment when he stops trying to hold together something that was already slipping through his hands. You once betrayed your own peace in an effort to keep alive a connection she was already halfway out of. You replayed excuses, softened her coldness into something noble, and romanticized the distance she used to hide her avoidance. You convinced yourself she just needed time or space or healing, anything but the truth that she wasn't willing to meet you at the level you lived at. But clarity has a way of arriving in silence. Not in dramatic moments, not in explosive endings. Clarity shows up when you finally stop forcing what is already gone. And when that clarity lands, it cuts clean. You suddenly see every small dismissal you once ignored, every quiet fracture you tried to explain away, every mixed signal that drained your spirit more than you admitted. You see how long you tolerated things that were shrinking you internally, slowly teaching you to accept emotional crumbs as if they were a feast. And that recognition hurts. It hurts because it shows you the version of yourself who kept trying long after the connection lost its pulse. It hurts because it reveals the depth of your loyalty, your sincerity, your hope, a hope she took advantage of because it made her feel valuable. But here's the sacred truth. Understanding this pain doesn't break you, it frees you. That same understanding becomes the foundation of your rebirth. It grounds you, steadies you, anchors you back into the man you were before your self-respect became negotiable. In silence, you learn that peace is not something someone else can give you. It's something you choose, and the moment you choose it, something powerful happens. Your silence doesn't just rebuild you, it exposes them. It exposes the truth behind her behavior, the avoidance, the fear, the emotional shortcuts she disguised as independence. It exposes the reality that she didn't leave because you were too much. She left because she could never rise to the depth you naturally carried. It exposes the very thing she hid behind her ego. She didn't reject you. She retreated from the version of herself your presence forced her to confront. And as silence reshapes you into someone stronger, clearer, and more sovereign, it forces her to face what she lost, because silence is the one thing she can't argue with, manipulate, or reinterpret. It reveals the truth she never wanted to see, truth about herself, her patterns, her limits. But the most important revelation isn't about her. It's about you. Your silence didn't collapse you. It collapsed everything that was never real, every illusion, every false hope, every dynamic built on imbalance rather than truth. And in that collapse, something new was born. A man whose worth no longer depends on being chosen, validated, rescued, or understood. A man who finally chooses himself. And when a man chooses himself, the world, and everyone who once underestimated him, feels the shift. Brother, here's the truth behind everything we just walked through. Your silence was never a reaction. It was a reset. It was the moment you stepped out of the role she boxed you into and returned to the man you were meant to be. You started in the pain of being discarded, in the instinct to prove your worth. But the moment you stopped reacting, the story flipped. Her power began to fall apart piece by piece because you no longer fed the emotional engine she used to control you. Your steadiness shook her more than your anger ever could. Your withdrawal cracked the ego she hid behind. And the distance you created wasn't punishment. It was healing. Then came the real shift. Her fear was never losing you. It was losing access to the version of you who gave more than he received. Your silence exposed the truth she avoided. She didn't leave because you were too much. She left because she couldn't rise to the depth you offered. And that brings you here to the final realization. Your growth doesn't begin when she returns. Your growth begins when you no longer need her to. Remember this, brother. Your silence didn't just change the dynamic. It rebuilt you into a man she can no longer break. If this message spoke to you, if it gave you clarity or the courage to stand your ground, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Stoic Station so you never walk this journey alone. You deserve guidance that sharpens you, not confusion that breaks you. And as you move forward, remember this. Silence isn't where your story ends. Silence is where the man you were always meant to be finally begins.